Okay. So we learned today, or we heard about the story of the fishes and loaves. And Linda was right. This is a fairly familiar story. See, this is a story that has meant a lot to the Christian church for years. Even right now, archaeologists have recently found a church on the shores of the Seas of Galilee. Now, remember, back then, when a church went to ruins, you would build another one right on top of it. And so they dug down a few churches deep. And they found this church that was probably built in the first 200 years after Jesus was resurrected. This church, at the front of the altar, had a mosaic, a tile mosaic, made all across over the altar, and it was a basket of loaves with 2 fishes, showing God's provision. This was an important story throughout Christian history. This was an important story to people of faith. And in fact, this is the only miracle that is shown in all 4 Gospels. This is an important miracle. This is a miracle that, at least in the book of John, shows who Jesus is. That he is a person of God, of relationship. See, John always wanted to highlight the relationship that Jesus had with his people. And so Jesus was out in this remote location, and he knew that there were crowds of hungry people. See, he had walked around with them, just like we talked about last week, up to the, thank you, darling, up to the seashores. And they would talk, and they would walk, and they eventually got pretty hungry. Now, the disciples realized how hungry they had become, the people that were there, after a long day with Jesus. And he said, what are we going to do with these hungry people? Well, Jesus kind of says, what are you going to do? Well, we don't have enough money. This would take more money than we could ever get. Where would you buy it? And we can't. Now, I think that what Jesus might have been looking for is something like, Lord, you can provide. We know that you can fix this situation. This is a test, after all. It's even spelled out in the Gospel of John. And yet, it's not what they say. It's not. They don't recognize the provision of God. Well, they do recognize who Jesus is, however. See, John, unlike any other gospel, notes that this happened during Passover. Passover, a year before Jesus was crucified. Remember, he comes in on the triumphal entry, and then he is crucified. Well, this is 1 year before that. He enters in at the festival of Passover, and this is kind of like our Independence Day. It's a Jewish Independence Day because remember what they're celebrating. They are celebrating that they were slaves in Egypt, and now we're going to be freed from Egypt. Every year they celebrate this, and every year they remember it. Someday the Messiah will come. So they were excited. This was an exciting time. Now, they certainly know well the story of Moses. They know what God did for Moses. What God did for Moses was help free the people. And when they had no food, he brought down food from heaven, manna, quail. When they were stuck behind the waters with being persecuted by the Egyptians, he opened up the seas and they walked through. Now, they are at this point where they are looking, seeking for the next Messiah. It is Passover. They are thinking of this history. And out comes this man, this Jesus that they have been following. Could he be the one? Could he be the Messiah? And he, unlike Moses, who had to have God drop the food in front of them, he multiplies the food in front of them. He had a Moses moment. He provided for them. And this other part of the passage where it feels like these 2 stories are stuck together, like why did the liturgical calendar put 2 stories in there? I just want to preach on one. Oh, well, that's because Jesus, he didn't have to ask somebody to part the water for him to walk across it. He just walked right across the top. See, Jesus made a statement in these stories that if you're waiting for the second Moses, he has arrived. The Messiah has come, and he is greater than the first. And the people there on the shore, they understood this. As you got to verse 14 in this reading, they talked about how he really is a prophet. They understood that he was the one that they had waited for. He was the one that they needed. In these stories, the story of the fishes and loaves, they needed physical provision. In the story where they were out on the seashore and they were afraid, they needed his spiritual presence. Both times, Jesus provided. He provided with a real understanding of what they needed. Now, as the people on the shore saw his provision, his physical provision, they said, we know who he is, let's make him the king. In fact, let's make him the king by force. Quick, let's get Jesus! Yeah, church, that doesn't work real well. They were not going to go against God's timing and will. They had figured out that he was the king. And they were right in that. But they had not figured out how this was going to work, that God was going to work on his own agenda. They understood the echoes of that Passover story, but they didn't understand that this was not a military leader coming. This was a God who was ushering in a different kind of kingdom, a spiritual kingdom. So this miracle really was kind of less about showing a miracle, more about showing who Jesus was. It was an appearance of God. Now, if you want the big fat Greek word, it was a theophany. I don't care for big fat Greek words. God showed up. That's what I care about. God showed up. He showed up and he showed himself. He showed up when he was needed most. He showed up with what people needed, and that was food. Later on, at that water, he showed up and he identified himself. Again, go back with me to the Old Testament. Go back with me to Moses. Moses stood at that burning bush and he said, "What is your name, God?" And he said, "I am." It's translated to Yahweh. You've heard of God called Yahweh. It means I am. Jesus starts walking across this water in this gospel reading. They are afraid in that boat and they said, "Who's there?" "I am Yahweh." "Jesus, is it you?" "I am Yahweh." Jesus has more than declared himself God in this picture. And he has declared himself as the God that shows up. The God who brings signs to let you know that he is there for you. This text has everything to do with who Jesus is. And I love how in the text, when they start gathering up these baskets of manna, they can keep it. They can use it. It can be eaten and utilized. Now remember what happened when Moses gathered up the extras? Turned into mold, rotten food by the next morning. You couldn't say you had to go to God every single day. But Jesus is a different kind of God. When what he gives you does not rot, it fills up inside of you, it works within you, and it never perishes. The kingdom that shall never end. What he gives you for life. He continues to feed you, and it continues to stay within you. See, this was able to show that Jesus could provide at all times. Even when resources are small, he can always provide. He provides every human need, and let's take it at face value. He provides when it's his basic as food. You know, as I was researching this, I want to talk just a little bit about the state of food right now. Across the world, we are in the middle of a major drought. You may have noticed in northern Michigan, you may have seen that it goes out west, and it goes all the way into northern Europe, and we are in a drought that could lead towards famine. On a typical time, We are at a global hunger of about 16%. Now, according to those that study food, at a normal time, it's not a growth problem. It's a distribution problem. In the United States, 15% of the people, 1 in 6 children, go hungry. See, this is kind of shocking to me. As I was a little girl, I remember my mom being a social worker in Petoskey, and I walked up and she had this big poster on the wall in her office, and it was a little girl about my age, maybe 8, and there was an empty bowl in front of it, and it said, "Most people that are hungry are too young to work for food." And it hit me really hard as a child that same age. And I didn't understand. See, all of my life, maybe you've been like me, all of my life, I've had a lot more Thanksgiving feeling days than I have days of hunger. Hunger hasn't hit me so much. But the people following Jesus, they were hungry. And as I grew up, I started to realize there were people around me that were hungry. That there are people in northern Michigan that have actual physical hunger needs. I had no idea. One day, about a dozen years ago, I encountered this for the first time. I was a substitute teacher in one of the local schools. Very northern Michigan schools. And I had a 3rd grade class. And we took the kids to free breakfast and went in there, and this little boy was a special needs kid who was 3rd grade, and he didn't realize what the social rules were yet. And I walked by and I saw the other kids teasing him, and I couldn't figure it out. Well, it was Monday morning, and he had reached in the garbage can to grab everybody's leftovers because he was so hungry. And I started to talk to him, and I asked him what was going on. And he said, "Well, it's Monday. I haven't eaten since free lunch on Friday." I didn't know what people encounter in northern Michigan. I didn't know that people could really be hungry. Well, later that school year, a new program started, one that I'd never seen before. And I must say that I was really proud, though I was not United Methodist at the time, but I'm really proud to say that it was the United Methodist Church in that town that started the backpack program, that started gathering food and bringing it in and packing it in backpacks and putting it on the shoulders of kids like this one, who I saw leave on Friday afternoon with a backpack full of food so that Monday morning he wasn't going through the garbage. Church, that's what it means to be Jesus in these situations. When I look at these scriptures and think, what does this mean to apply it to our lives? What does it mean when God calls us to be like Him, to be like Christ? It means to show up and meet a need that needs to be met. And it means to show up and to be present. Now, I have not visited our local food pantry here, but I do know that our church helps it now and helped to start it years ago, maybe 50 plus years ago. But I have been to the local one in Lansing, and I will speak on their behalf and say that when you go through there, first, they take you into a room with a spiritual mentor, someone that will pray with you, and they say, "Is there anything we can pray for you about? What can we do to talk to you? Is there anything you need? No, nothing? Well, then please go through the food line. But if there's something they need to pray for, you can pray for." They're doing what Jesus asked, showing up and being present and providing. That's what Jesus did in this passage. He showed up and He provided. He was present and He met people's needs. See, we are called to be like Jesus. And in looking at these passages and trying to apply that, all that I can find is that when a need appears before you, you help to provide. And when someone needs someone present, you show up. St. Teresa of Avila wrote, "Christ has no body now but yours. No hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands through which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands. Yours are the feet. Yours are the eyes. You are his body. Christ has no body now on earth except yours. This is what we are called to. So does that mean that we are to look, seek, hunt, and find? Well, maybe sometimes. And I will say from the head of our local food pantry here in Harbor Springs, I'm told that all of the giving is down right now. So maybe you hunt, maybe you look. You live in that tension between having maybe a Thanksgiving kind of household and knowing that there are others that have need out there as well. I can tell you what I did 12 years ago. What I did was I realized that I had missed a lunch in many years. And I looked at that little third grade boy, and he was getting ready to go home, and he had this vest with zippers all over it, little zipper pockets. And I walked up and I started unzipping the pockets and putting it in a granola bar, and then zipping the pocket, putting it in an apple, and zipping the pocket, putting in chips. And he says, "Mrs. Hitz, this isn't my food. I don't have any food. This isn't my food." And I looked him in the eyes and I said, "Oh, honey, this is yours. This is yours. Go home and take it." "Okay, Mrs. Hitz." 2 years ago, I watched that young man graduate high school. And I bet he doesn't remember that moment. Didn't mean anything to him. And I still carry that moment in my heart. I remember. Because when God calls you to be his hands and feet, I promise you it's more about the work that he's doing in you than the work he's doing in someone else. So I pray that you do keep your eyes open to be his hands and feet. You know, I preach sermons like these from time to time. And I was at preaching class last month. And even in these churches up here within the last month, we've had a visitor. Both of them said the same thing. My professor at seminary and the visitor here both looked at me quizzically and said, "You really believe what you're saying, don't you?" Yes. Yes, I do, because this is where hope lives. Hope lives in believing that Scripture isn't something dusty that sits on a shelf and is never used. It's something you absorb in your heart and live by. What Jesus said is the guidelines for life. It isn't something that we memorize and spit back out. It's something that we become as we become more like him. And that is the hope that we have. Because the hope, it's in the words of Christ. It's not in people. It would be misplaced if it was anywhere but in God. And that is the hope that sustains me. See, that hope reminds me that through our scripture reading today, we can see that Jesus cares for people. Jesus provides. Jesus may provide through you. He may provide through other means, but Jesus will show up. He will be present. And he will call you to be his hands and feet, to show up and to be present. And so, may we read Scripture, absorb it, and become more like Christ each day. Amen.